who, behind the scenes maintains all our great technical support. So we're always so thankful for Ian. And as you may know, I'm John Pattison Williams, and I am the coordinator of the Prairie Habitat Joint Ventures Policy Committee and Group. And really nice to see some of you here today and to welcome Paul Galpern. This is our ongoing, I'll give you a good introduction in a minute, Paul, sing your praises. This is probably the fourth session on agriculture and sustainability within this webinar series. And we're going to push towards Christmas on that. And so we're really thankful for Paul coming in today. And also next month, we're going to hear from the Canadian Canola Council from Ian Epp. So stay tuned for that. So today, really excited to welcome Dr. Paul Galpern from the University of Calgary. He is an associate professor in the Department of Biological Sciences, and he has been working quite extensively in the issues around pollinators and sustainability in crop production in Western Canada. Paul is a colleague and a good friend, and I'm really excited to hear his presentation this morning too. So welcome, Paul, and carry on. We will have questions at the end, and I'll moderate that as well. Okay, there you go.
All right. Thank you so much, John, for the introduction, and thank you also for inviting me here. It's a great pleasure to be here, to be speaking to you all. I've been asked to turn off my video, but I hope everyone can hear all right. Please let me know if that changes. So I wanted to start by giving you a little bit of background to what I'm going to talk about today. The topic or the title is Precision Conservation on the Canadian Prairies, Win-Wins for Habitat and Crop Yields. And the work I'm going to talk to you about has been ongoing since about 2015, and it's been funded by a number of local, national, and international funders. But the core funders, the ones that have really made what I'm going to talk about today possible, have been the Canola Council of Canada, Ducks Unlimited, particularly long-time partnership with Jim DeVries. I don't know if Jim has made it here today. And also with Alberta Conservation Association, who has also been a major funder of our work. So I run the Agriculture, Biodiversity and Conservation Lab at the University of Calgary, and this has been one of our core projects since about 2015. So what we're going to do is delve into these spots, these messy spots that you see right now on your screen. Those messy spots are messy because that's what farmers think of them as sometimes. They're the parts of their fields that get in the way of machinery. But increasingly, national, international work has demonstrated that these features, these elements, these non-crop vegetation areas, this mess, whatever you want to call it, is also the locus and the nexus of a lot of good stuff as well. So we're going to try and unpack that. And of course, I recognize that from the perspective of many in our audience, those are also habitats for breeding birds and waterfowl, and particularly in the case of wetlands. So let's dig in. But before we dig in, let's start with a land acknowledgement. I'm located in southern Alberta. So I'd like to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, which comprises the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, which includes the Chiniki Bearspaw and Wesley First Nations. And the city of Calgary, where I live, is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. And the work I am going to talk about takes place mostly in these traditional territories. And I've been very thankful to work and live there for the past 10 years. So here is the prairies, and the yellow bit that you see in the map in front of you is literally the footprints of prairie crops. Those yellow and orange dots are where the fields are. The white bits are where rangelands are, so that's not where the crops are, and the green is just all trees. So, I mean, if you just look at the yellow there, you kind of squint a bit and you say, wow, my goodness, there is a lot of farmland down there. There's a lot of crops being grown. In fact, the crop rotation footprint is about 520,000 square kilometers. Which is, that's, if you want to go European on it, that's basically the area of France, or 2 times the area of the United Kingdom. Or if you want to go Canadian on it, that's about 80% of Saskatchewan. So you just take all of those croplands and stack them up in Saskatchewan, and you've got about 80% of the province covered in nothing but wall-to-wall crops. It's a big area, and it's also a big potential. And that's how I think about it. And that's what keeps me going. We'll get to that in a minute. But let's also give you a little bit of introduction to the notion of precision conservation. So that starts with this concept of precision agriculture. And precision agriculture has been around for 20 plus years. It's the notion of let's include GPS data in our agricultural operations. So this combine harvester that you see here on the left drives around fields at the end of the season, and every second it records a GPS location as well as the amount of grain that is crossing a sensor inside. And it helps you produce maps like this one on the right. So this is a field somewhere in Alberta, I believe. And the red areas are where the yield is lower, and the yellow areas is where the yield is higher. And you can see that there's a little patch here at the bottom right of the field that constitutes about 1% of the whole field area, but that has a much lower yield. And that could be because it's either drier or wetter. Those are the major reasons for marginality, as we call it. But the farmer still seeds that area year after year. But what if he or she didn't seed it? What if they decided to convert it into perennial habitat? And that is the notion behind precision conservation. Can we identify parts of the landscape that are functioning below profitability for the landowners? And can we then incentivize them to turn them into habitat opportunities, whether that be for breeding birds, or, as I'm going to mostly talk about in this presentation, for beneficial insects? But let's just step back for a minute and imagine what here was 1% of the field, but let's say 6%. That's a reasonable estimate for, how much of the landscape is potentially sub-profitable. So if we could convince farmers to convert 6% of their fields, roughly that blue area, across that entire region, that represents a huge area, 31,000 square kilometers. Oh, somebody asking me a question, or are we okay? All right. So please interrupt me if there's any concerns. Some parts of the prairies may have about 50% of the actively farmed area that is marginal. So it could be actually well more than that 31,000. And one of the goals of a project we're doing called the Prairie Precision Sustainability Network, which I'll talk about at the end, the goal of that project is to figure out just how much there is out there and where it is. So let's just unpack what happens in a precision conservation kind of approach. So these maps here at the top left, they represent yield for a single field in 3 years, 2015, 2018, and 2021. Yellow means the yields for canola were higher, and blue lower. Canola is a great crop to look at in terms of precision conservation because it's the most valuable crop by far in the prairies. So if we're going to make decisions about land, we should be doing that in terms of canola, and everything else just falls in line. So that's the starting point, and that's an arguable position, certainly, but that's the starting point for thinking about canola. So then what we do is we combine the yields of these fields with commodity prices and input costs, and we create what we would call a profitability map of those fields. And here is the profitability map of that same field, and you can see here at the bottom right and in the mid left of those fields, the areas are redder. So this profitability map has been colored. So black areas are thresholds for profitability for the farmer. based on the yield of those crops. So, and this is amortizing across a 10-year period. So let's look at those yields across 10 years and look and see how often that part of the field was profitable for the farmer, given input costs and commodity prices. So most of the field is black, which suggests that when canola is $10 a bushel and up, that will be profitable for a farmer. And that's way below the price per bushel of canola in a typical year. But if canola gets up into the 22, canola almost never gets up to the $22 a bushel value, at least across over the previous 10 years. So big chunks of the land here, this red areas, have consistently been unprofitable for the farmer. So in fact, we calculated that they were profitable for canola only 1 out of the last 10 years. So what that means is there's an opportunity. Can we convince that farmer to restore those areas to perennial vegetation? And this indeed is one of the objectives of Ducks Unlimited's Marginal Areas or MAPS program. What we're doing with this, with the data here, is we're feeding into that program and helping them identify areas that could be incentivized for conversion. So let's just put a pause on the notion of precision conservation for a minute. Let's say you convince some farmers to do this. So what? Well, that's what most of my talk is going to be about. It's the so what. I recognize that many people in the audience are likely not farmers per se, or interested in agriculture or agronomy, but interested in the biodiversity part. So let's just imagine if we convince farmers to do this, to do precision conservation, to convert parts of their field that are not profitable, so what? And that comes down to what I call the merits of making fields messy. So let's just talk about messy fields, and let's look at messy fields and tidy fields from space. On the left, there is a satellite image of a part of southern Alberta which is full of these perfect quarter sections. Canola seems to be growing in many of them, and I would call that a tidy landscape. Those are tidy fields. But on the right, there's the same area, and I would say those are messy fields. You can see there's a lot more non-crop vegetation interspersed with the crop vegetation. And you would find both of these landscapes in different parts of Alberta and Saskatchewan and maybe not so much Manitoba, but they're representative across much of the prairies. So let's just drill in a little deeper. What do we mean by non-crop features or elements? All of these things, like the corners of these are pivot irrigation fields. The corners are unseeded. They're opportunities for habitat. We've got wetlands, very, very common across much of the prairie pothole region. We also have forested patches common in parklands. So a lot of variability across the prairies in terms of what the landscape looks like and what the non-crop elements look like. They could be pivot corners, shelter belts, forest patches, fence rows, road margins, and so on. The one that we focus on, and I know interests much of our audience as well, and particularly my work with Ducks Unlimited is focused on, is the wetlands. And wetlands, as many in the audience likely know, are a key feature of the prairie pothole region, which also overlaps with much of the agricultural cropland of the prairies. This is a very extreme figure on the left here. I don't think I've ever actually seen a field that was that pitted in potholes, but I think it gives you the idea that they're an important landscape feature. What does that mean for biodiversity? And as I mentioned earlier, biodiversity, as I'm going to discuss it in this talk, refers to six-legged, usually four-winged biodiversity, although sometimes we do talk about eight-legged variety over here on the left, but arthropods and insects generally, and in particular because those are the biodiversity that also matters to the landowners, and we'll get to that in a minute. So this is what a messy place looks like. A close-up on a wetland in southern Alberta. There it is. And we've got this grassy area surrounding the wetland, which isn't cultivated year after year. And you can see canola blooming in the distance. So this is an opportunity for natural enemies of crop pests. Things like this beetle. That's a hungry predator of the bad guys that the farmers want to get rid of. The lepidopteran caterpillars that eat their crops. So this is a reservoir, and as I'm going to show you, we've got evidence that these areas surrounding wetlands are indeed reservoirs for these beneficials. Also, possibilities for attracting bees, pollinators that may move out into the crop and assist in improving that crop yield through pollination. They're going to visit the wildlands surrounding this wetland to get the nectar, and they're also sometimes going to nest there, because many of our pollinators, our bees in particular, are ground nesters, and this untilled, undisturbed land is a great place for their nests. Unfortunately, in the field, there's frequent soil disturbance, whether that be the knives of the air seeder or tillage, which increasingly is happening less, fortunately. That's going to increase soil disturbance and make it less habitable for many of these beneficial insects. So just to summarize that notion, messy fields are hotspots for ecosystem services. There's the word that we use in our lab. And we're talking about pollination services. It's a regulatory service provided by bees, in this case for crops, but also for wild plants, essential for their reproduction, pest control services, and things that what we might call co-benefits of preserving these habitats are things like carbon storage in the perennial grass or above ground woody vegetation that tends to be preserved in these patches. Water quality and regulation, very important for also happening on these elements. And then something, of course, that many of the audience care about, habitat supporting services that can occur in these hotspots. Farmers are also concerned about the disservices that these features might provide. Weed. There are weed reservoirs that can spill over into the field. And certainly in some cases, we do see weeds spilling over from the edges of fields. And then pest services. They could be reservoirs for pests, and that's what farmers care about. So we can talk about these messy spots both as ecosystem positive services or disservices. But generally, the evidence suggests that on the balance, those services are positive. I'm going to talk about our work now since 2015, and there is a classic image of a field assistant. One of many that we've had through our lab. That's Rebecca standing in the middle of a canola field somewhere in central Alberta. And there's a typical image of the landscape in bloom. And since 2015, we've been funded by Canola Council, Ducks Unlimited, Alberta Conservation Association, a few other funders, to sample beneficial insects across a big chunk of Alberta's agricultural land. We've been up to Grand Prairie, but all the way from Edmonton, Vermilion over here, down to Lethbridge. And a lot of our work has been concentrated south of Calgary, near to where we live. And there's a image of where we've sampled. And that's 335 sites. 85 were within crop fields. Much of the rest were near crop fields, right in the ditches beside them. It's about 9,000 trap weeks of sampling. And we're well over 170,000 arthropods curated, probably well into the 200 or 300,000s by now. And this is what our operation looks like. This is bees. Did you know that our bees that we find in Alberta, there's about 300 plus species of bees in Alberta. There isn't just one, and only one of them has yellow and black stripes, and that isn't a native bee. The ones that we have in Alberta are bumblebees and solitary bees, and we've got blue ones and orange ones and green ones and furry, beautiful ones that we could take home and pet. Indeed, I have a bumblebee nest on the edge of my house, and some of them have been coming into our living room where we've been petting them. And this is an example of what our operation looks like. And we've also got harvestmen and ground beetles and so forth that we've surveyed and identified. So we're doing science. So we're interested, one of the things we're interested in science is how things work. So we ask the question, how do messy places work? And we work on the premise that if we were to retain or restore or create new messy places, creating new messy places being the point of precision conservation, we work on the basis that if that's our goal, why? What's going on? How does it work? And we do that through the lens of looking at the delivery of pollination and pest control services, particularly to the surrounding agricultural area and to the crop. And also, why would landowners care about this? Particularly, they would potentially care about pollination and pest control for their crops. And can we also see any evidence that it's actually having an effect on the crops? Is it increasing crop yield and in turn profit if we retain, restore, or create these spaces? I'm going to go through a bunch of studies now that we've done by numerous students, postdocs over the years. And I'm just going to hit the headline points here as we go through to give you really around the notion that these messy places in the agricultural landscape are reservoirs for biodiversity, in particular beneficial insects that we care about. And secondly, that they're actually having an effect, a service effect. More on that in a minute. So here's an example to one of the typical studies we did within the many studies we've done since 2015 is to run these transects near wetlands in fields 0, 25, 75 meters, and we actually go up to 200 meters in some cases away from wetlands. And we associate that with a control site in the ditch near the field. So this particular next few slides I'm going to show you involve 123 sites, 184 bee species over almost 1,000 trap weeks of sampling, 2015, 16, and 17. So we're going to show you a bunch of different species of bees, and we're going to show you what they did over the season on average across those years. And we're going to compare ditch, the control location, to the wetland location. And this is really about trying to understand what role the messy place, the wetland, has as a reservoir for beneficial insects that we care about. This mining bee, Andrena amphibula, one of the many solitary bee species we have in the province. You can see here across the season between day 180 and day 200 and something of the year, we'll expect bees to vary across the season because they like all organisms, they have phenologies. They vary across the season. So this bee is clearly more abundant in the early season, but you can see that it's always more abundant in the ditch and the wetland. So this is a bee that isn't really using that particular site. Again, here's another very, very common sweat bee, beautiful green thing. Agapostum texanus, common across much of the prairie habitat joint venture region. And this bee is much more common in ditch sites. So it's not really using the within field habitat, but it's using the near field habitat, that uncultivated edge of the field. This cactus bee similarly found more commonly throughout the season in the ditches and less at the wetlands. Now let's switch it around now. There's some other bees that are solitary. Again, more solitary bees. That means they don't have hives or colonies, but they prefer the wetlands. So here we have this Melisodes rivalis, another very common bee visiting thistles in particular, and Asteraceae, and more common in the ditches than, in the wetland area. That's the blue line than it is in the ditches. This digger bee, Anthophora occidentalis, you can see its abdomen poking out there, much more common later in the season, but always more common in the ditches. And this Diodasea australis similarly. Again, you can see evidence that these bees are seasonally very limited in their distribution across the season. They're phenologically limited. There's a close-up again on that digger bee. And as I said, most bees are ground nesters in Alberta. And solitary. So they basically just is one female laying a bunch of eggs in a long, thin nest in the ground. But we do have some social bees, like bumblebees, and this is a very common social bee, Bombus rufocinctus, and you can see it visiting their thistle. And they travel from much further away. They can travel up to 2 kilometers, whereas these social bees tend to travel up to 200 or 300 meters from their nest, so not so far away. But we can see evidence in the social bees of what I would call an aggregator effect. So they're not necessarily nesting in wetlands, but they come to the wetlands to forage because they are these sort of hot spots of where the flowers are. Now, these are 3 common social bees. This is the honeybee. But we also have 2 bumblebees here, but they don't seem to prefer wetlands. They seem to be found more common in the ditches. But here's the 4 opposite cases. 4 bumblebees, Bombus borealis, very common. Nevadensis, huge, like a flying bomb. If you've ever seen a massive bumblebee come at you somewhere, it's probably Bombus nevadensis. Turnarius and Occidentalis. Occidentalis has been in the radar of biodiversity and conservation people in Western Canada because it used to be really common. It is now much less common, and there's all sorts of discussion about Kosiwak and Sara listing. We found a lot of them near wetlands, and all of these bees were found more commonly near wetlands. So this could be because they're responding to flower availability, but whether they nest there or they just visit there, wetlands are clearly an important feature for these bees. So again, our goal here is to unpack how messy places work. We've talked about how they might work for a few focal bee species, showing that for some, wetlands and the neighboring vicinity of those wetlands provide forage, nectar, pollen, and possibly nesting habitats for those species, and it varies across the season. Again, our goal here is to understand what if we retained and restored and recreated more of these spaces on the landscape, and what would the consequences be for ecosystem services. Let's stay on that story a bit further, and I'm going to talk to you now about another study we did, which is what I would call a landscape scale or a landscape ecological study, published in Agricultural Ecosystems and Environment. We've had a number of papers in this journal, and I like to brag about it because it really is. It is about the best we could hope to do to publish any of our work internationally. This is a top agricultural journal in the world, and really, our work isn't going to make it into Science and Nature, but if it makes it into this, this is about the best we can hope for. And I think I'm very proud of some of this work that we've done. This is part of our study focusing on an area of dry but still productive cropland south of Calgary, Alberta. And you can see that there's really only 4 major types of landscape features as we classify them. Cropland, what we call dry semi-natural, mostly deciduous trees, balsam poplars, and as well as shrubs, and then perennial grassland, which is largely ranch lands, but also found in adjacent to rivers and streams, and then wet semi-natural, which is mostly wetlands. So what we did in the study is we wanted to understand the relative roles of the diversity of habitats. That's what we call patch richness. So using these 4 major land cover types, cropland, semi-natural, perennial, grassland, and wet semi-natural, using these, is there an effect on bees in particular? And also, how is that habitat distributed on the landscape? Is its contagion important? So this is a study who tried to tease these apart by selecting locations across the landscape that actually contrasted these 2 variables. And so this was actually a designed experiment at a landscape scale. And what we found is that more patch richness led to more bee diversity. So having more land cover types meant more bees. This isn't a surprise. More species of bees, I should say. This isn't a surprise. We know that from a bunch of literature, but we found that in Alberta. We found that cropland area, the amount of cropland nearby, or the contagion, how that landscape is interspersed. And this is an image of a highly contagious landscape. This is one. This is a highly contagious landscape, and this is a low contagion landscape. So didn't seem to have an effect on bee diversity. But we found that cropland area had an effect on the count of bees, and that was a temporal effect. So more cropland, that's over here, meant more bees early in the season, and this could be an effect due to the blooming of canola. Later in the season, more cropland meant slightly fewer bees on average. So this may be because that cropland essentially becomes free of any resources the bees need. There's no flowers blooming because the crops have canola has passed, and wheat, of course, doesn't have resources that bees need. So later in the season, we see fewer. But one of the main messages of this paper was that we can't really predict anything. Bees are not a monolith. And I'm not going to try and unpack what this figure shows, but the main idea is that there's a lot of variability. These are about 39 species we looked at of bees, and this is how they responded, either positively or negatively, to cropland area or the richness of land cover or the contagion of land cover. And I think if you think it looks like a mess, it is. And the mess is ultimately, I think we can conclude, bees are not a monolith, and they're responding in a taxon-specific way to landscape. So messy fields may not always support higher abundances for all species. And I think that's another key message of this slide, is that, you know, some bees do really well when there's more cropland. That's the bees at the top of this figure on the left panel. But some bees don't do so well when there's more cropland area. So, you know, there's definitely this variable effect. So yes, messy is good for some species, but not always for all. So that's, if you like, a caveat. We're doing science here, so we need to add the caveats. Again, our goal was to understand how messy places work. And one of the effects, the mechanisms we talk about, is a spillover effect. And we've done a great deal of work in our lab in what we call spillover from these habitat elements. So that's really, it doesn't get any more complicated than what those arrows show. Are the animals that use that feature as a reservoir, are they spilling over into the crop? And here is a bit of art done by one of my very talented master's students, Tobin Neem. They've drawn this image showing what that looks like in terms of various beetles moving into the crop and doing their business in the crop, which in this case could be predation, or as another one of my students is discovering, weed seed predation as well. So not just eating the crop pests, but also eating the weed seeds as well. So if you want to just talk about what this looks like from a scientific perspective, you can, along the x-axis, we're going to create figures that look like this, basically, in our work. So along this axis, we have distance from the edge. This is closer to the edge, and then moving along the axis, we're further from the edge of a messy feature. So this is basically moving out into the field. And on this axis, this is the amount of something. Could be the amount of animals that are in the field, or it could be the amount of service we're finding in the field. Really quite a simple way to test for spillover. So if we find a statistical relationship that's negative, so less of that effect further into the field, we often conclude that this spillover is happening, because like a boiling pot that is bubbling over, we expect more of the boiling water to bubble over close to the pot and less to make it out into the field. So that's really the analogy we use with spillover. So I'm just going to take you through some figures that show, indeed, we found spillover. We found this relationship as we moved away from wetlands and other non-crop vegetation areas. So here it is for bumblebees. Not so much early in the season, but late in the season, there's more of them closer to the feature and fewer into the field. And indeed, we have a paper published in Biological Conservation led by my postdoc at the time, Jess Vikrak, who looked at this across 132 species and found, and this is a summary figure of that, indeed, spillover occurring in wheat and canola fields. That's the yellow and the black lines. So more right at the edge of a wetland, fewer into the field. But when you take a pasture that wasn't cultivated, you didn't find this effect at all. So that was like a control, suggesting that indeed these features are playing an important role in the landscape because they're effectively reservoirs. Now on to the beetles, the natural enemies. Pterostochus melanarius. This beetle is ubiquitous and it is hungry. It eats everything, weed seeds, but probably more often it eats other members of its own species. Very cannibalistic, but also earthworms and crop pests as well. We, in fact, one of my students did a gut study on Pterostochus, and we found indeed that there were some Lepidoptera in its gut. So it's also eating things we care about, but maybe more often than not, it's eating its own species. But we're not going to talk about that at length. But it is an important natural enemy in fields just because it is so abundant. And indeed, we find evidence of a spillover here early in the season, not so much in the late season. So again, closer to the edge, far from the edge. Here's the amount. Blue line is the early season relationship for this beetle, not so much late in the season. Spiders, again, we looked at 18 species of common spiders, and indeed we saw the same effect here too, particularly late in the season. Early in the season, they tend to be moving around. So understanding this temporal effect on ecosystem services is an important remaining challenge, I think, in this area of work. How do messy places work? It's our big question. And so far, we've been talking about the amount of animals as a sort of index of the potential for service to occur. If there's more bees there, then there's going to be more pollination. If there's more beetles there, there's going to be more pest control happening. But now let's look at some other evidence that ecosystem services are occurring. So we stuck some plasticine caterpillars out in the field, and amazingly, these things keep records of when beetles have bitten them. And you can see marks of where beetles have actually bitten this test caterpillar. And we also did that for egg cards. We put out killed lepidopteran eggs on these cards in the field, and we waited 6 hours and saw how many were left. This is called a sentinel prey approach, and this was led by a student of mine called Sylvia Jensen and also Tobin Neem. And indeed, we found a spillover effect for the caterpillars, and we think that mostly it's Pterostachys melanarius, this beetle over here, heading out into the fields, and it's doing most of its busy work closer to the edge in what we call a halo. More on that in a minute. And we also found that more eggs were consumed. We don't know who was consuming them, but more eggs were consumed closer to the edge of the field than further into the field, suggesting there's more potential for service near to the edge of the future. So both of these studies are forthcoming. And here's a picture of Pterostachys melanarius eating some eggs. Could it be this beetle that's doing all the work? We don't know, but we certainly suspect it. So as I say, 90% of our egg predators were this beetle, and it's abundant and everywhere, and a great deal more work needs to be done in this species, just because it is so abundant in our fields. Just a quick word on disservices. Students of mine, Rebecca Innes, looked at how the impact of these features on pests that we care about, things like leafhoppers, caterpillars, lygus bugs, and flea beetles. And we found really very little evidence, except for leafhoppers, that they were spilling over into fields. So basically, these crops were attracting the pests, but it had nothing to do with the features themselves. They were just, the pests were coming to the crop because the crop was food, not because they were spilling over. Leafhoppers, not so much. There was some evidence of spillover there, but leafhoppers are not an important pest. So what does spillover look like when you map it? Here's a little sort of map. Redder areas indicates what that might look like, and that gives you an impression of why mess might matter. A field on the left here has less mess, and you can see that the spillover effect from the marginal areas around the field, the ditches and so forth, there's less red. But if we have more mess in our field, you can see that there's more parts of the field that are proximate to the places where the spill might come from. But a farmer might say, well, there's less places in that field for me to farm. And of course, they're right. So there's definitely trade-offs there. So we've talked now largely about evidence for ecosystem services, spillover, reservoir effects of messy places like wetlands and field edges. But what about crop yield? So can the spillover effect also yield to lead to what we call a halo effect? Do the farmers see any evidence that the spillover matters to what they care about, the crop? And the answer is, here's the punchline, yes, there is a halo effect. And we've published this again in our favorite journal, and we're very proud of the fact that we were successful in doing this. This is some of the first work that demonstrates that landscape elements actually can boost crop yields. And this was done with a combination of remote sensing and precision agriculture in these 4 papers recently published. So again, precision yield data, but we bring to that Sentinel-2 satellite imagery. So we basically build models that connect precision yield data on the ground to evidence from space. And that allows us to get data from about 750 canola fields in northeastern Alberta near Vermilion. And there's a map of all the fields that we analyzed using this approach. So just to show you our approach, we can basically predict precision yield from space by building models. So on the left, there is a map of a field. You've seen this one before, redder areas, lower yield, yellow, higher areas. And here's the map we made from the space data on the right by understanding the relationship between optical satellite data and the data on the ground. So not perfect, but pretty darn good. In fact, we got it to within 12% accuracy. But we found halo effects when we analyzed those 750 fields. And again, this is the same figure you've been looking at. 0 is the edge of the field, or where the non-crop area is, 250 meters out into the field. And here is the effect on the mean yield. In this case, it was canola. And right at the edge of the field, you see a lower yield. Moving into the field, we see this halo. So this above average yield from about 25 to 150 meters into the field, and then it returns to the field average later on. So we interpret this as a halo effect. And what's causing that? Is it the animals moving into the field, eating the crop pests? Is it the pollinators boosting the canola yield? Or is it the fact that many of these non-crop areas have more fertile soil, or because they're wetter? And in a dry land, wet means higher yields. It could be all of those things, and we don't really know. But we've got evidence that there is an association here causing higher yields. And indeed, another study done by another postdoc of mine really looked at, really drilled into the effect of different types of non-crop areas. So we didn't find a halo effect in grassy margins, but we found it in shelter belts, which could be a shading effect. But really the bottom line is that, you know, mess is good, and I hinted at this earlier, mess is good for yield, but you don't want it too messy. And a really large 750 field study allowed us to really drill into that. Messy is good, but balance is best. So here's a sort of summary figure of what we found. So this axis shows how many other crop fields are nearby. So there's few at the left here, more on the right. So this is really an index of how messy is your part of the prairies. Are you in a very locally messy part or a not so messy part? And this is how messy is your particular field, low to high. So we tend to find, more of a yield boost to the surrounding crop at this sort of intermediate place, where you're in a landscape where this is sort of a more intensely farmed part of the landscape. In your field is messy, you're going to see more of a yield boost. I'm sorry, I didn't explain this figure super well, but I can go back to it if there's more questions. The other part that I want to just talk about is just a very brief study we did with insurance data. So we've talked about using satellite data and precision ag data, but we also did that from field returns that farmers had provided us to see if we could sort of corroborate the same message. And we had 60 million seeded acres of data from 2012 to 2017. Not just canola this time, we had wheat, barley, peas, and oats across 66 municipal districts. And indeed, we looked at this and we found that it's much harder to identify a halo effect because this data isn't spatially explicit. But we did find an association between higher non-crop areas and higher yields. So when an area of the province of Alberta had more non-crop areas, the crops also had higher yields. And that was controlling for things across a vast area like Alberta, like soil variables and climate as well. So once we controlled for those things using a spatially explicit model, we still found evidence for yield boosts associated with non-crop areas. So the message here is the halo effect is real and it pays for itself. And we did find indeed that although the area of the halo may be limited into the field, it's probably more than enough to offset what this effect, which I'll go back to here. This is the edge effect. So farmers know that right at the edge of the field, the yield is always lower. It's more exposed, it's drier, it's wetter, who knows what it is. Yield is always lower right at the edge, but the halo more than pays back for this edge effect. So farmers haven't been celebrating the halo for a century because it isn't a big deal. It doesn't give them a lot of extra money. It just kind of offsets a depression in yield. So does the yield effect matter in terms of a farmer's bottom line? Well, it's not a compelling story, certainly, but it does exist, and it offsets a potential loss. And that's important from a scientific perspective, and also a persuasive one. So I'm just going to wrap up now, and I'm just going to bring the pieces together. So we started with the notion of precision conservation, and we started with the notion of what would happen if we were to take an area of this farmer's field, like this 1%, and we changed it to a messy place, a place that might be habitat. So again, here's our process. I showed you this before. We can start with these precision yield maps across a decade. We can actually use our remote sensing data to help us from the satellite. And we can make maps like this one here, profitability maps that help us inform farmers and help Ducks Unlimited through their MAPS program, inform farmers about which parts are the best ones to restore. And if we restore those parts of the fields, as indeed the MAPS program has been doing, although not yet guided by our data, hopefully they will be soon, they will, there's a lot of potential to restore big chunks of the landscape. And that, I hope I've shown you, also has potential for services to farmers. So I mentioned earlier the Prairie Precision Sustainability Network. This is been going now for a year, co-funded by Ducks Unlimited and Environment Canada. And our goal with this project has been to really identify, to map at broad scales these low profitability areas, in part to know where they are, also to inform where we can create new restorations, and also to understand how that varies across parts of the prairies. We're doing this in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. And here is our pitch. So if you know any farmers that are willing to contribute precision agricultural data, we start with their data and we combine that with satellite data. We so far have had over 60 participants across the prairies, and they've given us a ton of data, which we have used to really build some excellent maps. So finally, the notion here, why did we start? We started with the notion that messy fields can give us services. And I know folks who are listening to me from the audience, you know, it's not just about the pollination and the pest control services to crops. For the audience here, it's also about all the other services as well, like the carbon storage that can happen in wetlands, in wetland margins, or in treed areas, or in the roots of perennial grasses. So it's also about habitat support for breeding birds, whether they be songbirds or ducks and waterfowl and waders. All of these opportunities are there when we understand where these messy areas are and the possibility for restoration. And that's where precision conservation comes in, and really looking at the potential for conservation at very small footprints. So I'll end things there with just a shout out to the many folks who have all helped us, and the many funders here as well. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Paul. And we can all give our virtual clap or emoticons, whatever you want to do that for Paul. And thank you very much for that talk. Your experience as an educator, both at the university and even as a high school science teacher, if I recall, come out and very through in your speaking. So thank you.
Thanks for that.
Yeah, we have a few minutes for questions. And so I want to allow people to, I'll let that percolate and think through right now. I'll start it off though with just a very simple one, saying, how do you pet a bumblebee? You said you let them into your living room and pet them. There's more courage than I do, but
well, that I've got to be honest with you. By the time they made it into my living room, they weren't moving very much. So I think it could be that the queens had at the end of the season, the queens developed and they're looking for a place to overwinter. So they might have entered into our house and yeah, so we moved them outside.
Oh, very good. Very cool. All right. Anyone else? Something, perhaps a more serious question. Feel free to put it in the chat or to raise your hand or just unmute yourself and speak if you like. Yeah, Tracy Scott.
Yeah, this is great stuff. I appreciate it. One of the things that John and I and my colleagues at Alberta NAWAMP have been trying to solve is the age-old problem of what's in it for the landowner around wetland conservation. And you just gave me an awful lot to think about and an awful lot to chew on. Do you think that I guess by what we've seen, it appears that we probably can put a dollar value to the benefit of wetland retention, depending on the individual property. But do you think we could cobble together a bit of a? I'm kind of speaking on behalf of Alberta NAWAMP right now, but we would like to actually put together a document that makes essentially a business case. Would that be a project that could be doable based on your research, Paul, is what I'm trying to get at.
Great question. So I don't feel we're quite yet at the point of being able to put a dollar value on a given wetland, because the wetlands are so variable, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So I think we do definitely need more research on that, and I think the best way to do that research would be through the same way we demonstrated the halo effect in the first place, by combining remote sensing with on-the-ground data, and then really drilling into different types of wetlands. And I think we could then come up with good estimates for yield boosts over time. I think we can use the same principles if you like, but I think certainly it's still a doctoral level or postdoctoral level work required there to be able to produce what I would say are reliable estimates for you to use in documents. I think at this point we can say it's positive and it's a little bit positive, but I don't think I'm more comfortable in saying much more than that.
Fair enough. No, that's fair. Thank you.
Thanks, Tracy. And yeah, we can maybe follow up after with you, Paul, on that one. Marianne Posberg, please go ahead.
Thank you. My apologies for not showing my face. My interconnection is not great, even in the middle of the city. So I guess further to that previous question, perhaps it's not ready for the business case, but I do wonder about the work that you've done on extension in the field. So just curious if there have been many field days using the producers in the fields that you've had to perhaps get some feedback from those producers.
So my interaction with producers has been largely through sort of small local conferences and larger ones. I've been to a couple of field days, but I think it's a really good idea that we need to do more of that. it definitely, if you know how we can do more of that, please let me know. But our message to producers and growers is generally, that there are positive effects of these features. But I don't feel that the greatest, if you like, if the axis of convincing or sell, if you like, for farmers is going to be that positive boost to yield. The biggest axis, I think, is going to be on saving money by converting negative profitability areas. So if I were to choose a way to convince farmers to conserve more, yes, the yield boost thing, the halo effect is certainly part of the story, but I think the bigger story, and the one that we're going to get more traction on, is stop farming the bits that lose you money, and let's confine them at a very small scale.
Yeah. Just to note, yeah, I think I can try to follow up with you about potential extension opportunities.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, excellent point, Paul, about that areas that actually are losing farmers money. That's, as a farmer and someone involved in some of that economics work, I think that's a really powerful point. Blythes. And if you want to introduce, pardon me, as well, your organization you're with too, if you feel like, you're welcome to. I think you have your hand up. Is it Blythes, if I'm getting it correct? I think I'm not hearing you. Your mic is off, but Paul, can you hear?
No.
If you'd like to put it in the chat, possibly there's something with the mic. But yeah. We do have maybe while you're doing that or sorting that out, Blythe, Jim Fisher, would you feel free to go ahead, and then we'll come back to you. We haven't forgotten you, Blythe.
Yeah, thanks, John. Yeah, Jim Fisher with Delta Waterfowl. Great presentation, Paul. That was really informative and lots of intrigue around this. I worked on the Alice effort for a long time, and this is all stuff they talk about, and yeah, the areas that aren't productive, I think that's where we have a chance. And then protecting areas also ties in with this for, and figuring out the right price point. Like there may be some positives that the producers receive from these messy areas, as you call them. I find that quite a neat way of saying it. But and then I was really interested on the Canola Council and their kind of messaging as a result of this. Are they kind of taking up the reins at all, Paul? Do you see them? I mean, as a nonprofit, kind of conservation group, we're in a different kind of I don't even know how to say it, but the Canola Council would more be in line with the average producer mindset. So I think they could have a bigger impact, if you will, perhaps, than us nonprofits telling our story without money and everything associated with it. But what's your take on Canola Council and their ability to move the needle perhaps on some of these things?
I think it's huge, and I'm very hopeful. That's why working with them gives me a lot of, and they've funded me now since 2015 to focus mostly on beneficial insect reservoirs and spillover. That's been their chief notion, but they're increasingly interested in sustainable ag, in part because it's not just about, it used to be mostly about social license to operate, but it's also now about, for them, about meeting sustainable ag standards that are increasingly internationally important as well as nationally important. Carbon is a huge thing on their radar. And they of course take their direction from growers. In fact, all of their funding comes from growers at the field level. But I think it's a very positive move towards sustainable work. And frankly, I'm quite proud to be associated and working with them, because I think that is how we move one of the needles. There's also the conservation needle, which we also work with as well.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jim, for that question, and thanks, Paul. And that's a good segue for next, as I mentioned, next month's webinar on October 11th. We'll be with Ian Epp from the Canadian Canola Council. So I'm quite excited to hear what he will convey. And yeah, please stay tuned for that one. I do believe Blythe has the audio sorted out, so feel free to go ahead if you can. Here's where we cross our fingers and hope, hey? Uh-oh, I think it's not working. You know, I wonder if you could type it in. Otherwise, you can email me and I can convey these questions to Paul and we can engage in that way. But I also would like to honor Paul's time and all of your time. And we have reached the end of the hour. And so unless there's some, I'll give you 1 minute for one burning question, anyone. Well, we got praise, burning praise has come through for some of these. So
Thank you for listening.
Yeah, we really appreciate it. Thank you all for attending and have a wonderful September. And we hope to see you in October. Thank you so much.
Thanks for inviting me, Jim. John, sorry.
Jim works. See ya.
I don't know why Jim was in my head.
Jim DeVries, he was going to be here,
He
but
was gonna
he said he wasn't. So.